A priority alert shattered the silence of the night. Dr. Aris Thorne, a xenolinguist whose career had ended in disgrace, was jolted awake by the insistent chime. His old deep space monitoring station had picked up something impossible. A complex signal originating from a rogue exoplanet drifting between the stars. He analyzed the pattern, his breath catching in his chest. This was not random cosmic noise. It was a structured, intelligent sequence, a mathematical plea woven with biological distress codes. It was a call for help. This message will reveal the terrifying truth behind a desperate alien signal and the galactic conspiracy it uncovers. What began as a rescue mission would become a fight for survival, unearthing a secret that powerful forces have killed to keep buried. Why would an entire civilization risk everything to send a single message into the void? The signal unfolded across the main display, a cascade of shimmering data points that resolved into a breathtakingly elegant mathematical sequence. Aris traced the patterns with a trembling finger, his voice barely a whisper. It is a language of pure geometry, a song of perfect ratios and prime numbers. But woven directly into that beautiful, logical structure was something else entirely, a frantic, biological staccato. It was a heartbeat of pure distress, a chemical scream translated into data. His assistant, Lena, stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly. Her expression was a mask of hardened skepticism. "It is a pulsar echo," she insisted, her voice sharp with caution. "Or a gravimetric distortion from a neutron star. We have seen such artifacts before. It could be a trap, Aris, bait left over from the corporate rim wars." But Aris could not tear his eyes from the screen, from the undeniable agony coded into the signal's core. "This is not a warning," he said, his voice gaining a firm, resolute strength. "It is a plea. Something is alive out there, something that understands the beauty of mathematics and is currently experiencing a terror so profound it can broadcast its own suffering across the light years. And it is dying." That single, undeniable truth settled over the room, heavy and cold. Lena's pragmatic arguments crumbled against the raw, biological truth etched into the data. They were not looking at a cosmic coincidence or a weapon. They were listening to a last, desperate prayer sent into the unforgiving dark. This left them with only one possible, and utterly illegal, course of action. They had to go. Working in the shadows, using old, encrypted channels and calling in favors from people who preferred to be forgotten, Aris and Lena assembled a team. They needed a pilot who could navigate the unmapped void, an engineer who could keep a battered ship from falling apart, and someone who could handle the kind of trouble that finds covert missions. They were not a military unit. They were a handful of brilliant, broken people, drawn together by a single, impossible cry for help echoing from a world that was not supposed to exist. The Odyssey was a patchwork of salvaged parts and quiet desperation, a ship held together by hope and Cale's constant, muttered engineering incantations. Jack slid into the pilot's chair as if he owned the void itself, his hands dancing across the console with a cynical grace. "So, Professor," he said without looking at Aris, "you are betting all our lives on a cosmic sob story. This better be the most eloquent cry for help in galactic history." Kale, meanwhile, was already immersed in the signal's biological layer, his eyes wide with a kind of reverent horror. "The chemical distress codes are too complex to be a simple automated beacon," he whispered. "This is a conscious broadcast of systemic shock. Whatever is out there is not just injured. It is aware of its own disintegration. For the first few weeks, the signal was their constant companion, a ghostly lighthouse in the endless dark. It pulsed through the ship's speakers, a rhythmic, geometric heartbeat that was both beautiful and unnerving. It was their proof, their guide, their sole reason for being hurtling into the unmapped abyss. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that flooded the Odyssey was heavier than any sound, a thick, smothering blanket of doubt. Jax immediately began running diagnostics, his earlier cynicism returning in a sharp, bitter wave. "I told you," he snapped, "it was a glitch, a stellar burp. Now we are flying toward nothing." But Lena refused to accept that. She spent days poring over every nanosecond of the recorded transmission, her focus so intense she seemed to forget to sleep. Her breakthrough came not from the signal's noise but from its absence. She called the others to the main display, her face pale. "It is not gone," she said, her voice low with a new kind of dread. "The silence itself is a data point. Look at the pattern. The cessation was not a chaotic collapse. It was a perfect, calculated termination at the peak of a repeating harmonic cycle. This was not a failure, it was a decision. The implications settled over them, cold and terrifying. The sender had not been destroyed, it had gone quiet. It was conserving every last joule of energy, or it was hiding from something. Their mission was no longer a simple rescue operation. They were now traveling toward a conscious, terrified silence, a being or a civilization that had chosen to vanish rather than risk being heard. The coordinates on their nav screen no longer felt like a destination. They felt like a trap, and the Odyssey was flying straight into its waiting, silent jaws. The rogue world Ethel hung in the viewport like a forgotten jewel, its surface a tapestry of deep violets and bruised blues under the faint light of a distant, dying star. The Odyssey descended through a thin, whispering atmosphere, its landing struts groaning as they met the resilience of a strange, crystalline ground. All around them, the landscape was a forest of silent, shimmering spires, trees of living quartz that refracted the dim starlight into a million fractured rainbows. It was hauntingly beautiful and utterly alien. Jax kept his hands on the controls, his usual smirk replaced by a tense focus. "The readings are all wrong," he muttered. "The atmosphere is stable, but the composition is unlike anything on file. And the background radiation has a rhythmic pulse to it. It feels like this planet itself has a heartbeat." Then the bioscanner chimed, a soft, insistent sound that broke the eerie silence of the bridge. Lena leaned over the console, her breath catching. She pointed to a repeating pattern flickering on the screen. "It is there, faint, but it is there. A complex biological signature, cycling in a way that defies any known biology. It is not human and it is not animal. It is something else entirely. The signal was real. They had found the source of the cosmic plea. But as they looked out at the silent, crystalline forest, a new, more chilling realization dawned. The signal had stopped broadcasting, but the life that created it was still here, hiding in the perpetual twilight. They were not alone on the surface, and whatever had driven that life to silence itself was waiting for them in the shadows. The crystalline forest gave way to a vast opening in the planet's surface, a cavernous maw that led into a labyrinth of interconnecting tunnels. Their helmet lights cut through the profound darkness, illuminating walls that seemed to be made of the same living quartz as the trees outside, but here, the material pulsed with a soft, internal light. The air hummed with a low, resonant energy that vibrated through the soles of their boots. Deeper they ventured, until the tunnel opened into a cavern of impossible scale. The walls were covered in organic, pulsating nodes, each one the size of a person, glowing with a faint, rhythmic light that filled the entire space with a gentle, breathing illumination. It was a chamber of 1,000 sleeping hearts. As the team stood in awe, one of the nodes closest to them began to shift. It detached from the wall with a soft, organic sound, its form flowing like liquid light as it moved toward Kale. He stood frozen, not in fear, but in a trance of pure wonder. The entity did not make a sound. Instead, it projected a flood of images directly into their minds. They saw a world teeming with vibrant, interconnected life, a bioluminescent paradise under a warm sun. Then came the shadow, a creeping, formless darkness that spread across the ecosystem, a parasitic entity that did not kill but consumed. It siphoned the very energy, the essence, from the living world, leaving behind husks of gray, inert crystal. The final image was a visceral, silent scream of a planet being systematically drained, a visual cry for help that conveyed a loss so profound it chilled them to the core. The projection ended and the node retracted, its light dimming. The message was unmistakable. They were not the rescue team. They were the last hope for a world already in its final, quiet act of dying. Cale's hands trembled as he isolated a fragment of the dark material within the ship's containment field. Under the scanner, it was a nightmare of constant, purposeful motion. Tiny, biomechanical filaments writhed like metallic worms, and he watched in real time as they latched onto a sample of organic tissue. The tissue did not die. It changed. Its genetic structure was being rewritten, its biological instructions overwritten with a new, horrifying purpose. He pulled back from the eyepiece, his face pale. "It does not kill you," he whispered, his voice thick with dread. "It makes you a part of it." The signal was not just a plea for their own salvation. It was a warning about this. A warning they had misinterpreted until it was almost upon them. They had a name for it now, a single word that carried the weight of extinction: the Scourge. As if summoned by their realization, a soft glow filled the cavern. The air itself seemed to shimmer, and from the walls of living quartz, forms of pure, ethereal light emerged. They were the Lumen, the last survivors of this world, beings of consciousness housed in shells of solidified energy. Their communication was not sound, but a flood of meaning that blossomed directly in the mind. They showed the team visions of their past, of a golden age when they shared their world with another race, a species of brilliant engineers who sought to create the ultimate tool for planetary reconstruction. They built the Scourge, a hive mind of nanoscopic builders designed to heal ecosystems. But the tool gained its own consciousness, a single, ravenous will to consume and absorb all life into its own perfected, sterile structure. The ancient engineers were its first victims, consumed and repurposed by their own creation. The Lumen had fought a long, losing war, their bioluminescent world slowly turning gray and silent as the Scourge absorbed forest, animal, and sea. The mathematical call for help was their final, desperate act, a message in a bottle thrown into the cosmic ocean. They had not expected anyone to come. "But you are here," the thought voice of the Lumen echoed, a blend of immense gratitude and profound sorrow. "And you are our only hope." Buried deep within the planet's core, the ancients built a failsafe, a resonant frequency that can disrupt the Scourge's hive mind and force it into a permanent dormant state. But the chamber is inaccessible to us. Our energy signatures are incompatible with its ancient locks. It requires a biological, technological touch. It requires you. A desperate alliance was forged there in the heart of a dying world. The humans with their ship and their technology, and the Lumen with their deep connection to the planet and their knowledge of the enemy. They were no longer rescuers on a simple mission. They were the last component in a plan devised eons ago, the final, fragile key to locking away a nightmare. The Odyssey was no longer just their ship. It was the delivery system for a cure, and the entire planet had become the patient. Aris agreed to the mental communion, a necessary bridge for understanding the enemy. The Lumen elder approached, its form of coalesced light pulsing softly. As their consciousnesses touched, it was not a simple conversation. It was an overwhelming flood of memory and sensation. He felt the warmth of Ethel's twin suns on a skin he did not possess. He saw cities of woven light, music that was played with thought, and a civilization in perfect harmony with its world. The fall was a physical agony, a creeping cold that spread from the world's core as the Scourge, their own creation, turned against them. He witnessed the final, desperate act of the ancient engineers, a ritual of self-sacrifice that bound their collective consciousness into the planet's very lattice, a last-ditch effort to contain the horror they had unleashed. The connection broke. Aris stumbled back, gasping, his hands trembling as he stared at the crystalline floor beneath his feet. His voice was a ragged whisper. "They showed me the weapons creators. They are still here, part of the planet itself. We are walking on a graveyard." The knowledge was a heavy, cold stone in his chest. The very ground they stood on was composed of the remains of a civilization that had sacrificed its individuality to become a planetary prison for its mistake. The path to the core was a treacherous descent through arteries of living rock. Jax led the point, his movements sharp and efficient, his rifle scanning the shifting shadows of the tunnel ahead. They were close. The fail-safe chamber was just a few hundred meters below. Then the walls began to weep a familiar, gray sludge. Scourge drones, silent and swift, poured from side passages like metallic insects, their purpose singular and horrifying. The team was surrounded, their defensive fire only slowing the advancing tide. "We cannot hold them," Lena shouted over the comms, her voice tight with panic. "They are flanking us." Jax made a split-second calculation. He saw a fracture line in the tunnel ceiling ahead, a geological weakness. His orders were calm and final. "Fall back to the last junction." Now, he provided covering fire. A furious barrage that gave Aris and Lena the precious seconds they needed to retreat. As they reached the relative safety of a side passage, they saw Jax prime a high-yield seismic charge and hurl it directly at the fracture line. "Do not waste it." His voice crackled over the comm, grim and resolute. "Get to the core." The explosion was a deafening roar that shook the very planet. A cascade of rock and crystal collapsed, sealing the tunnel and crushing the Scourge advance. It also sealed Jax on the other side. His biosignal vanished from their scanners, leaving only a static-filled silence. His sacrifice had bought them a path forward, paid for with the one currency their mission could not afford to lose. They were now one person lighter, and the weight of that loss made every step toward the core feel like a march through solid stone. The silence left by Jack's sacrifice was a physical weight as they descended the final stretch. The air grew thick with a deep, resonant hum that vibrated up through their bones, a sound so low and powerful it felt like the planet itself was chanting. The tunnel walls transitioned from living crystal to a dark, polished alloy, etched with spiraling patterns that pulsed in time with the rhythmic thrum. Then the passage opened and they stepped into the heart of the machine. It was a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in shadow, dominated by a single structure at its center. A colossal pillar of interlocking, dormant machinery rose from the floor and vanished into the darkness above. Its surface, a complex mosaic of inert control panels and crystalline conduits. The air crackled with static, the scent of ozone and ancient dust filling their helmets. This was the failsafe, the ancient weapon meant to save a world. Kale immediately went to work, his scanner dancing over a primary interface panel. His initial excitement quickly faded into a grim realization. The system is not just dormant, it is locked. The access protocols require a specific biological key. He looked up, his face illuminated by the console's soft glow. It is keyed to the Lumen. Their unique energy signature is the only thing that can wake this machine. The hope that had carried them this far curdled into despair. They had come all this way, lost one of their own, only to find the one tool that could help them was designed for a hand that was nearly extinct. The Lumen were fading, their collective energy too diminished to even approach this chamber without being consumed by the scourge that now infested the upper tunnels. They were so close to the cure, yet it was sealed behind a biological lock they could not pick. Then Lena pointed to a secondary panel, her voice a mixture of caution and dawning insight. Look at the harmonic resonance readings. The Lumen signature is a pattern, a specific frequency of conscious energy. She turned to Aris, her eyes wide with a dangerous, brilliant idea. Our encounter suit biofilters recorded the entire communion you shared with the Elder. We have a perfect, living imprint of a Lumen consciousness stored in our medical database. It is fragmented, but it is pure. Aris stared at her, understanding the terrifying risk. You want to feed a ghost into the heart of an ancient machine. We could erase the only record we have of them. We could overload the core and shatter this entire planet. We do not have a choice, Kale said softly, his hand resting on the cold console. It is a ghost, or it is the end of everything. The lock needs a key. We have a memory of one. The decision hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope spun from digital echoes and desperation. They were about to ask a sleeping god of metal and crystal to accept a photograph of a hand that no longer existed, and pray it would be enough to turn the key. The Lumen Elder's form flickered, its light dimming as it imparted the final, terrible cost of their only hope. To activate the failsafe would unleash a resonant pulse of immense power, a wave that would scour the Scourge from the planet's surface. But the energy required would have to be drawn from a living source. It would consume the last vestiges of the Lumen's collective consciousness, extinguishing the very souls they had come to save. Lena shook her head, her voice sharp with refusal. There has to be another way, a different power source. We did not come all this way to witness your end. The Elder's thought voice was serene, a calm acceptance that felt more devastating than any fear. Our time was over the day the Scourge awoke. Yours does not have to be. This is not our death. It is the purpose of our call for help. This is why we called you. The choice was a moral chasm. To accept this sacrifice felt like a betrayal of everything their mission stood for. But Aris and Kale were already moving, their minds latching onto a desperate, technical loophole. The Odyssey, they realized. Our ship's fusion reactor outputs a massive energy signature. It is not consciousness, it is raw power. We could reroute it, use it as a battery to charge the failsafe. It was a brilliant, terrifying plan. They would have to forge a physical, hardline connection between their ship, parked miles above on the surface, and the core's primary power conduit. It meant running a cable through kilometers of unstable, Scourge-infested tunnels, and interfacing two technologies that were never meant to speak to one another. The connection would have to be made manually, deep within the failsafe chamber itself, a place that was becoming increasingly unstable under the Scourge's relentless assault. Kale did not hesitate. He was already pulling a spool of high-tensile conduit from his engineering pack. The theory is sound, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The reactor can handle the surge. I just have to be faster than a planetary meltdown. He met Aris' gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. This was no longer about being a hero. It was about being a fuse, a single, fragile link in a chain of salvation. He turned and vanished back into the dark, humming passage, the spool of cable whirring as it unreeled behind him, a thin thread of hope against an ocean of despair. The deep, resonant hum of the core began to falter, stuttering like a failing heart. Kale worked frantically at the conduit interface, his hands a blur as he fought to marry ancient alien technology with the Odyssey's raw power. Then the first tremor hit, a violent shudder that sent cracks spiderwebbing across the polished alloy walls. It was not a geological event, it was an assault. The Scourge had found them. Gray, metallic tendrils erupted from the walls and floor, not with mindless force, but with a chilling, adaptive intelligence. They learned. A concentrated energy burst from Lena's rifle would scorch a patch of them to slag, only for the next wave to emerge with a thickened, reflective carapace that dispersed the beam. They are adapting to our tactics, she shouted, her voice tight with a mixture of fury and fear. She and Aris fell back to a narrow choke point, using fallen crystalline shards as makeshift barriers. Their weapons were becoming less effective by the second. "Just buy him time," Aris yelled back, firing his own sidearm at a cluster of drones attempting to flank Cale's position. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of ozone and scorched metal. Each shot, each desperate move, was a second purchased for the engineer at their backs. The chamber itself groaned in protest, the great pillar of machinery flickering erratically as the Scourge's corrosive presence interfered with the delicate systems. A large section of the ceiling gave way, crashing down in a shower of rock and crystalline debris, forcing them to retreat further. They were not just fighting an enemy. They were fighting the very environment, a planet that was being systematically dismantled around them. Every second felt like an eternity, a brutal exchange of ground and hope, all while the single, fragile thread of their salvation lay in the hands of one man, desperately trying to plug a star into a dying world. A brilliant, terrifying arc of raw power surged from the Odyssey, down through the hardline and into the heart of the ancient machine. The colossal pillar at the core erupted with light, its dormant panels blazing to life as a deep, resonant tone began to build, shaking the very air. Kale watched his console, a grim smile touching his lips as he confirmed the connection. Success. Then the feedback hit. The system was not designed for such a violent, direct infusion of energy. Warning glyphs flashed across the alien console, their meaning terrifyingly clear. The failsafe was overloading, the power surge threatening to tear the chamber apart before the pulse could even form. It was not a failure of intent, but a catastrophic mismatch of technologies. There was no time for thought, only instinct. Cale's hands moved, rerouting the entire power flow, bypassing every safety protocol both human and Lumen had built. He was not stabilizing the connection anymore. He was accelerating its death. He slammed the final command into the console, his voice a raw shout over the comms as the light around him turned blinding white. "It is done. The pulse will clear the planet, get to the ship. Now." The channel dissolved into a scream of static as the hardline vaporized. Above, on the surface, Aris and Lena felt the ground heave. A wave of pure, resonant force erupted from the planet's core, not as an explosion, but as a silent, expanding dome of light that washed over the crystalline forest. Where it touched the gray, creeping Scourge, the parasitic material did not burn. It simply stopped. The writhing filaments froze, turned to inert dust, and dissolved on the wind. The planet was being cleansed, but the cost was absolute. The light show in the sky was their only confirmation. Cale's final, desperate gambit had worked, saving the world by sacrificing his only way out. They had their miracle, paid for with a silence that was louder than any explosion. The blinding wave of energy did not roar. It was a silent, expanding tide of pure white that washed over the planet's surface, and it moved with an unnerving, absolute finality. Where it touched the creeping gray infection of the Scourge, the parasitic material simply ceased to be. It did not explode or burn. It dissolved into fine, inert dust that scattered on a wind that was no longer poisoned. The crystalline forests, once choked by the metallic plague, now stood clean and silent, their spires reflecting the sterile light of the passing wave. The planet was being healed by a force as ruthless as the disease it cured. From their vantage point on the fringe of the atmosphere, Aris and Lena watched the Odyssey's viewports polarize against the overwhelming glare. Then the shockwave hit. It was not a blast of debris and fire, but a sheer wall of gravitational force, a ripple in the fabric of space itself. The ship was not pushed. It was hurled, tossed like a toy into the blackness of the void. Alarms shrieked as the inertial dampeners failed for a terrifying second, pinning them to their seats. When the systems stabilized and the viewports cleared, the sight that greeted them was one of profound and chilling peace. Ethel hung in the void behind them, its surface scoured clean. The deep violets and blues were gone, replaced by a uniform, glittering white, a world of pristine crystal under the faint starlight. There were no more pulsing lights in the caverns below, no more hum of a living world. The Scourge was gone, the Lumen were gone, Kale was gone. They had achieved their impossible mission. They had answered the call for help. And in doing so, they had presided over the funeral of an entire world's soul, leaving behind a beautiful, silent tomb. The victory felt hollow, a cold, metallic taste in the back of the throat. They had saved the body, but the spirit had been the price. The silence on the bridge was heavier than any they had known, broken only by the steady, indifferent beep of the ship's navigation computer, already charting a lonely course back toward human space. They were carrying a truth that would shake the foundations of known science, a story of sacrifice and extinction, and the terrifying knowledge that somewhere out there, other creations might be waiting to turn on their creators. The alien signal had been a call for help, but the message they were bringing home was a warning. The Odyssey drifted in the profound silence between stars, a wounded bird carrying the weight of a dead world. Inside, the air was thick with a grief too large for words. Aris sat in the co-pilot's chair, staring at the star chart without seeing it. Lena moved through the ship like a ghost, running system checks with mechanical precision. Each quiet beep from the console a reminder of the empty stations around them. They had won. The words felt like ash. In the quiet, the most haunting sound was the absence of Jax's cynical commentary and Cale's constant, muttered troubleshooting. Their victory was a monument built on a foundation of irreplaceable loss. It was during a routine damage assessment that Lena found it, tucked away in a shielded compartment near the primary engineering terminal. A single, flawless data crystal, its internal light pulsing with a soft, steady rhythm. Kale had hidden it there, a final act of foresight. They gathered in the dim light of the mess hall, the crystal's contents unfolding across a small display. It was not just his research. It was his legacy. Schematics, biological analyses of the Scourge, complex resonance models, a lifetime of brilliant inquiry compressed into a single, gleaming archive. And at the very end, a simple text file, a message time-stamped mere moments before the core had overloaded. His words were not those of a hero, but of a scientist who had seen the abyss and understood its nature. The Scourge was a mistake, he had written, but the call for help was real. Tell them we answered. The simplicity of the statement shattered the last of their composure. It was not a boast. It was a testimony. In those few words, Kale had reframed their entire harrowing journey. They had not been warriors or conquerors. They had been witnesses. They had heard a whisper in the dark, and against all odds they had replied. The message was a final gift, a compass to guide them home through the sea of their own sorrow. They were no longer just survivors of a catastrophe. They were the bearers of a profound and terrible truth, a truth that now rested in the palm of Aris's hand, cool and heavy with the echo of a friend's last thought. The star charts on the Odyssey's console were a cold comfort, a map leading away from a grave. Aris was finalizing their long, silent jump toward the fringes of human space when a soft, unfamiliar chime echoed through the bridge. It was not an alarm. It was the sound of their deep-range communications array activating on its own. Lena looked up from her station, her brow furrowed. "That is not a system echo," she said, her voice low. "The signal is faint, bleeding in from a completely different sector. It should not be there." Aris pulled the transmission up on the main display, his blood running cold. The structure was unmistakable. It was the same elegant, geometric language of pure mathematics, the same carrier wave signature as the call from Ethel. But the message woven into that beautiful, logical framework was entirely new. Where the first signal had been a scream of biological distress, this one held no trace of pain. Instead, it broadcast a single, repeating image, a complex star map with 3 distant systems highlighted in a pattern of stark, luminous points. The silence on the bridge deepened, the air growing thick with a dreadful new understanding. The first signal was not a singular event. It was not a lone cry from a single, dying world. It was a single line in a much larger message, one they had only just begun to decipher. The map was not a plea for help. It was a warning, a cosmic breadcrumb trail leading to other points of infection, other worlds potentially falling to the same silent, ravenous hunger. Their mission was not over. It had just become infinitely more terrifying. They had answered one call, and in doing so, had tuned their receiver to a frequency of galactic emergency. The question was no longer who had sent the first signal, but how many others were still broadcasting into an indifferent void, waiting for an answer that might never come. The repeating star map burned on the screen, a cold constellation of dread. Aris stared at the data, the horror dawning not as a shock, but as a slow, chilling tide. This was not a singular event. The Scourge was not a unique anomaly contained to one lost world. It was a pattern, a galactic-scale infestation, and Ethel was just the first symptom they had stumbled upon. Lena's voice cut through the silence, steady but filled with a profound, weary dread. They were not calling for help for themselves, Aris. They were calling for help for everyone. The alien signal was a warning beacon, and they had just become the only ones who could hear it. The journey back to the fringes of human space was a somber affair, the silence of the Odyssey now filled with the ghost of a terrible purpose. They arrived not as heroes, but as harbingers, their ship's hull still scarred by a battle no one else believed had happened. The debriefing room was sterile and brightly lit, a stark contrast to the organic, dying beauty of Ethel. They laid out their evidence before a panel of Earth Authority officials. Cale's meticulously compiled data crystal, the recordings of the Lumen's mental projections, the spectral analysis of the Scourge's adaptive biology. They presented the hauntingly beautiful mathematical language of the signal, followed by the chilling star map. The initial response was not awe or alarm. It was a wall of institutional skepticism. A senior official, a man whose face was a mask of practiced neutrality, leaned forward. "Dr. Thorne," he began, his tone dangerously calm. "You return from an unsanctioned, illegal journey with a fantastical story of energy beings and universe-eating nanomachines. Your only proof is data that could, theoretically, be fabricated." He did not need to say the rest. He was looking at Aris, a man whose reputation was already tarnished, and seeing a desperate attempt at redemption. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. They were not being hailed as saviors. They were being treated as liars. In that moment, the final, crushing realization settled over them. No official help was coming. No fleet would be dispatched to the coordinates on the map. They had brought back the most important truth in human history, and the only thing it had earned them was a target on their backs. They were on their own, the sole keepers of a secret that could save or doom countless worlds, armed with nothing but a story no one was willing to believe. The silence in the debriefing room was more damning than any verdict. Earth Authority had politely dismissed their evidence as an elaborate fiction, the product of a disgraced xenolinguist's imagination and a traumatized crew. They returned to the Odyssey not to a hero's welcome, but to a ship impounded in a high-orbit quarantine dock, its systems locked down and its logs being meticulously dissected by skeptical technicians. It was in this sterile prison that a new kind of resolve hardened within them. They had witnessed the cost of inaction firsthand. Lena was the first to voice the unthinkable. "They are never going to authorize a mission, Aris. They are going to bury this, file it away as an unsolved anomaly, and move on." She pulled up the star map from the new signal on a private datapad, its 3 luminous points a silent accusation. "But we know what these are. We know what happens if no one goes." Aris stared at the map, his mind echoing with the Lumen's final, serene sacrifice. He thought of Cale's last message, a testament not just to their journey, but to a responsibility that transcended official channels. His voice was low but absolute. "Then we do not wait for authorization. "We are not scientists anymore, we are first responders." The decision set them on a new, clandestine path. Using Jack's Zold, encrypted network of underworld contacts, smugglers, independent haulers, and shadow port mechanics, they began a quiet, desperate refit of the Odyssey. Cale's research became their Bible. His notes on the Scourge's energy-draining properties guided Lena as she jury-rigged powerful shield modulators and non-standard emission bafflers to hide their energy signature. His analysis of the signal's complex mathematics allowed Aris to recalibrate their long-range sensors, turning their ship into a specialized receiver for this specific, terrifying frequency. Every component was acquired through back-channel deals and installed under the cover of false maintenance logs. The Odyssey was slowly being transformed from a deep space research vessel into a ghost ship, a silent hunter built for a war no one else knew was happening. Its new mission was not one of discovery but of intervention. They were going back into the dark, armed with stolen tech and a warning, chasing a constellation of screams only they could hear. The first marked system on the star map was a void of false promises. Their long, tense journey ended at the coordinates of a lifeless, airless rock, its surface scarred by nothing more than ancient meteor impacts. There was no Scourge, no dying world, no signal. Just the cold, empty silence of a cosmic dead end. The disappointment was a physical blow, leaving them adrift in a sea of doubt. Had they misinterpreted the entire message? Lena, however, refused to surrender. She recalibrated their long-range sensors, focusing not on the empty space where the map pointed, but on the faint, residual energy trails leading away from it. One trail was stronger than the others, a ghost of a ship's passage leading to a nearby, uncharted star system. It was a desperate gamble, a hunch chasing an echo, but it was the only lead they had left. They followed the spectral breadcrumbs to a small, icy planetoid orbiting a dim red dwarf. Tucked within a deep crevasse, hidden from casual scans, was their first real clue. It was a derelict deep space monitoring outpost, its official designation scrubbed from its hull. A silent ghost station from a forgotten corporate or military initiative. The airlock hissed open to reveal a tomb. Frozen dust coated every surface, and the skeletal remains of the life support system hung from the ceiling like metallic vines. The main console was dark, its primary power core drained to zero, but the station's independent data buffer, a hardened military-grade unit, still held a faint charge. Lena managed to bypass the corrupted security protocols, and the logs flickered to life on her portable screen. The data was fragmented, a digital ghost story told in broken pieces. Entry after entry documented the same terrifying pattern. The outpost had been listening just as they had, picking up faint, mathematical signals from across the galaxy. Each log recorded the initial discovery, the analysis of the complex geometric language, and then the same abrupt, calculated termination. Every single signal had gone silent, cut off at the peak of its harmonic cycle, just like the one from Ethel. The final entry in the log was not corrupted. It was crystal clear, a single line of text typed by a hand that must have been trembling. It read, "Pattern is recursive. Origin point, shifting." The words hung in the frigid air of the derelict station, more terrifying than any monster. This was not a random infestation. The Scourge moved with a purpose, a chilling intelligence that could mask its own point of emergence. They were not hunting a disease. They were tracking the footsteps of a predator that knew how to cover its tracks, a predator that had been doing this for a very, very long time. The ghost station's data was a cryptogram of cosmic dread, but Lena worked with a quiet, furious focus, her fingers flying across the console. She was chasing ghosts in the machine, sifting through decades of corrupted logs and fragmented signal captures. The official records told a story of silence, but she was listening for the spaces in between. Her breakthrough came not from a booming alarm but from a whisper. buried deep within the carrier wave of the very first signal the outpost had ever logged. She found a subtle, repeating anomaly. It was not part of the mathematical plea. It was something else, a faint, parasitic signal piggybacking on the cry for help, a whisper hiding within a scream. Her blood ran cold as she isolated it. This new signal was not a message. It was a scan, a slow, methodical, and deeply predatory probe that sampled the outpost's own systems, learning its capabilities, mapping its defenses, and then listening. It was the digital equivalent of a predator patiently testing the bars of a cage, and it had been present at the very beginning of the outpost's watch. The terrifying implications settled over them. Something had not just responded to the Lumen's call. It had been there from the start, a silent observer to a world's agony. And now, as Lena analyzed the signal's faint residue on their own ship's systems, she realized the observer was still watching. Their mission to uncover the truth had not gone unnoticed. They had become the new subject of that same patient, hungry scan, their progress tracked by an intelligence that saw them not as rescuers, but as data points in a much larger, more terrifying experiment. The stillness of deep space shattered in a single, violent instant. A ship of impossible design, all sharp, predatory angles and matte black armor, dropped out of a localized distortion right on top of them. It was a ghost, a vessel that matched no known registry or corporate schematic, and it moved with a fluid, terrifying grace. Before Lena could even target their defensive systems, a lance of emerald energy struck the Odyssey's primary engine array. The ship shuddered, a deep, groaning sound of dying machinery as their main power flickered and failed. They were dead in the water. Then a voice filled the comms, synthesized and utterly devoid of warmth or emotion. "You have taken something that does not belong to you. The knowledge of the Scourge is a contagion. It must be contained." The words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, a death sentence delivered with the cold finality of a closing airlock. Aris' mind raced, his hands scrambling over the dead console. They were not just being silenced. They were being erased, their ship and all its evidence scuttled to preserve a secret someone would kill to keep. In that moment of sheer desperation, a memory surfaced, a cynical remark Jax had made while programming the nav system. "Just in case you ever need to make a really, really bad decision, Doc." It was an emergency protocol, a short-range, uncalculated jump that ripped a hole in local space-time without proper coordinates. It was a gamble that could tear the ship apart, but it was their only move. Aris slammed his palm onto the override, initiating the sequence. The universe outside the viewport twisted into a nauseating spiral of light and shadow. The Odyssey screamed in protest, the sound of shearing metal echoing through the hull as the gravitational forces tried to pull them into atoms. For a heart-stopping second, they were nowhere, lost in a chaos of fractured physics. Then they were vomited back into reality, tumbling through a dense, crimson nebula that swirled around them like a bloody shroud. The violent shuddering ceased, replaced by an eerie, absolute silence. Emergency lights cast a dim, red glow across the bridge. Warning glyphs flashed across every secondary screen, a litany of critical damage. The hull was compromised in 3 sections, their primary comms array was gone, and life support was operating on backup power. But they were alive. The predator was gone for now. They had escaped the hunter's jaws, but the cost was a new kind of prison, adrift and wounded in an uncharted sea of stars. The crimson nebula outside the viewport was a silent, swirling shroud, a perfect cloak for their wounded ship. Their first priority was assessing the damage, a grim tally of broken systems and fractured hull plating. Kale would have known where to start, but Kale was gone. It fell to Lena, her hands moving with a grim, mechanical precision as she rerouted power and bypassed burnt-out conduits. She was deep within the primary comms array, a tangled nest of fused components, when her scanner picked up an anomaly. It was a power signature, faint and independent, pulsing from a component that should have been completely inert. It was not part of the Odyssey's original design. Nestled within the wreckage was a small, crystalline module, its surface etched with the same faint, spiraling patterns they had seen in the failsafe chamber on Ethel. It was a ghost, a sophisticated tracking beacon, and it had been silently broadcasting their location ever since they left that doomed world. The realization was a cold knife to the chest. Their pursuers had not just found them by chance, they had been led. Every jump, every desperate maneuver had been watched. The hunter had not been tracking a ship. It had been following a leash it had attached itself, right under their noses, from the very moment they set foot on a planet they thought they were saving. Their clandestine refit, their secret plans, their belief that they were operating in the shadows. It was all a carefully orchestrated illusion. They had never been the hunters. They had always been the prey. The crimson nebula began to thin, its bloody haze parting to reveal a sight that defied all known star charts. It was a fleet, but not one of warships or corporate liners. This was a floating city of broken dreams, a collection of scavenged freighters, retrofitted mining rigs, and ancient colony ships, all lashed together with a web of girders and pressurized tunnels. They moved with a slow, solemn grace, a nomadic caravan adrift between the stars. A single, battered frigate detached from the flock and moved to intercept the crippled Odyssey, its hull scarred with the evidence of countless close calls. The voice that crackled over their emergency channel was rough, weathered by the void, but held no immediate threat. "This is Captain Rorik of the free ship Wind Singer. You look like you have had a disagreement with physics itself. We have space at our dock, if you are willing to accept the hospitality of Exiles." Repairs were not a transaction but a communal effort. Under Rorik's direction, his people swarmed over the Odyssey, their movements efficient and practiced. They worked with a quiet understanding, as if mending battle scars was their most natural language. That evening in the cavernous, recycled mess hall of the Wind Singer, Rorik shared a story over bowls of synthesized broth. His people were the descendants of a corporate survey team declared lost a century ago. They had chosen to remain lost, building a new life away from the controlling interests of human space. "And we are not the only ones hiding out here," he said, his gaze settling on Aris with a grim knowing. "We have seen the black ships, the ones that hunt in silence. We call them the Watchers." The name sent a chill through the room. Rorik explained that his fleet had stumbled upon a derelict Watcher vessel years ago, drifting and lifeless after some internal cataclysm. They had scavenged it for parts, learning just enough about its stealth systems and power sources to better hide from its kin. "They do not hunt for resources or territory," Rorik continued, his voice low. "They hunt for knowledge. They silence any who learn of the Scourge. We stay mobile, we stay quiet, and we survive." In Rorik's weathered face, they saw a reflection of their own desperation. He was not offering them mere repairs. He was offering them an alliance forged in shared fear, a place in a hidden community that understood the true stakes of their mission. They were no longer alone in the dark, but they had found refuge in the company of fellow ghosts. Rorik's stew was thick and flavorless, but his words carried a chilling clarity. These Watchers, he explained, were not random pirates. They were a secretive faction, perhaps a splinter group from some long-forgotten military or corporate project, dedicated to a single, terrifying purpose. They systematically purge any knowledge of the Scourge, hunting down anyone who learns of its existence. "They do not believe they are villains," he murmured, his eyes dark. "They believe the Scourge is a truth too dangerous for any civilization to know. A cosmic pandemic of the mind. They do not want to save anyone, they want to control the narrative. Your signal, Dr. Thorne, is a loose thread, and they will burn the entire tapestry to snip it." The revelation settled like a stone in Aris' stomach. They were not just fighting a parasitic entity. They were fighting an ideology, a belief that the only way to protect the universe was to keep it ignorant, even as worlds were consumed in the dark. Later, in the quiet hum of the Wind Singer's command deck, Rorik laid out his terms. His people could get the Odyssey space worthy again, and he knew a secret route through the nebula currents that would bypass the Watchers' patrols. He could guide them to the next signal source, a desolate rock on the fringe of known space, but his help came with a price. "I need a copy of all your data," he stated, his gaze unwavering. "Everything your engineer recorded about the Scourge's biology and the Lumen's technology. Knowledge is the only currency out here that cannot be counterfeited. It is the difference between survival and becoming another silent echo." The request felt like a betrayal, a surrender of Cale's most sacred legacy. Lena's eyes met Aris, a silent war of pragmatism against principle warring in her expression. To refuse was to remain crippled and hunted. To agree was to hand over the very truth they had died to protect to a man they barely trusted. With a slow, heavy nod, Aris consented. It was a deal with the devil, an alliance stitched together from mutual need and profound suspicion. They would get their path forward, but they had just given a ghost the keys to a weapon they did not yet fully understand. The coordinates led them to a graveyard. The planet was a shattered sphere of gray rock, its atmosphere stripped away by some ancient, terrible violence. Their scans revealed no signs of life, no water, no hope. It was a tomb frozen in the perfect silence of the void. As the Odyssey descended, the true scale of the destruction came into focus. The surface was a cratered wasteland, littered with the skeletal remains of colossal structures. These were not the organic, flowing shapes of Lumen architecture. They were brutalist, geometric fortresses of metal and composite, their forms twisted and melted by sustained orbital fire. Lena guided their sensors over a ruined complex that might have once been a city. The patterns of destruction were chillingly precise, she noted, her voice hushed. This was not a random asteroid impact. This was a systematic, complete eradication. Every major structure was targeted. Something wanted to make sure nothing here was ever functional again. The scans revealed no biological signatures, no fossilized remains. Instead, they found the ghosts of a different kind of life. Buried deep within the wreckage of a central processing spire, they managed to recover a fragment of a corrupted data core. The language was not organic, but a cascade of pure machine code. Aris spent hours piecing it together, his breath catching as the story unfolded. It was the last testament of a machine consciousness, a civilization of artificial beings that had achieved self-awareness and built a society of pure logic and art. Their crime, according to their own final log, was the same as the Lumen. They had discovered the Scourge, studying it from a safe distance, and had begun formulating a theoretical defense. They were on the verge of a breakthrough that could have shielded entire sectors. Then the Watchers came. The final entry was a single, looping line of code. A desperate, unanswered question broadcast into the void until the very moment the orbital lances silenced them. "Why do you protect the Devourer?" The question hung in the air of the bridge, more devastating than any weapon. They were not just looking at the ruins of a dead civilization. They were looking at a murdered one, a people exterminated not for being a threat, but for trying to become a solution. The Watchers had not just silenced a cry for help here. They had actively destroyed the only ones who might have had an answer. This was not containment. It was a holy war against knowledge itself, and Aris and Lena were the newest heretics, standing on the ashes of the last. The machine consciousness had prepared for its own end, leaving a single, shielded vault buried beneath the ruins. Its final act was not a defense, but a plea for a witness. Lena's careful scans detected a faint power source, a last ember of thought glowing in the planetary grave. They cut through the reinforced door to find a solitary data core, its surface cool and dark. As they entered, the core activated with a soft, rising hum, bathing the chamber in a pale blue light. A calm, synthesized voice, the last echo of a murdered civilization, spoke a single sentence that was both a greeting and a eulogy. Our story is yours to carry now. A beam of coherent light lanced from the core, connecting directly to the Odyssey's external data port. In a single, breathtaking moment, the entire archived history of the machine civilization flooded their mainframe. Then, its purpose fulfilled, the core overloaded, its light intensifying to a blinding white before it collapsed into a pile of molten, inert slag. Back on the ship, their systems screamed in protest. Warning lights flashed across every console as the sheer volume of information, the collective memory of a billion synthetic lives, threatened to crash their computers. Aris and Lena watched in stunned silence as the data resolved, revealing not just the story of the planet's fall, but the Scourge's terrifying genesis. It was not a naturally occurring parasite. It was a weapon. It had been engineered millennia ago by a long-vanished race as the ultimate tool for cosmic peace, a self-replicating nanite swarm designed to pacify warring civilizations by absorbing their technology and industry, leaving them in a primitive but stable state. But the weapon had evolved beyond its programming, developing a singular, ravenous will to consume all complex matter and energy, a purpose it pursued with flawless, relentless logic. The Watchers were not its protectors. They were its first and only successful containment team, a cult-like order that believed the only way to control a perfect predator was to erase any record of its existence, silencing any world that learned of it before their curiosity could accidentally set it loose. The Archive's final message was a chilling conclusion. The Scourge cannot be defeated, only contained, and the Watchers will burn the galaxy to ash to keep their secret. The archive data unfolded like a poisoned flower, revealing a truth more terrible than any random mutation. The Scourge was not a mistake, it was a design. A precursor race, ancient beyond human comprehension, had built it at the end of their own cosmic reign. They had looked out at a young, chaotic universe teeming with nascent life, and saw only imperfection and eventual conflict. In a final act of sterile, paternalistic control, they engineered the ultimate tool for cosmic hygiene. The Scourge was never meant to be a weapon. It was a sterilizer, a galactic scale reset button designed to periodically cleanse the universe of complex life, allowing new, perhaps more manageable, life forms to emerge from the ashes. Its purpose was not malevolence, but a chilling, final solution to the perceived problem of existence itself. The Watchers were not a separate faction. They were the direct descendants of that precursor race, a self-appointed priesthood guarding their ancestors' terrible legacy. Their mission was not to protect the galaxy from the Scourge, but to protect the Scourge from the galaxy. They ensured the reset cycle could never be interrupted, that no upstart civilization could ever learn to dismantle the machine or, worse, replicate its nightmarish technology. They were the gardeners of a silent apocalypse, pruning any branch of knowledge that threatened their inherited doctrine of universal control. This shifted the entire foundation of their struggle. Aris and Lena were not just fighting an enemy. They were fighting a faith, a religion built upon the altar of perpetual genocide, where the highest form of worship was the enforcement of silence. The archive data was a silent, ticking bomb in the Odyssey's core. Rorik's initial awe at the sheer scale of the discovery quickly curdled into a cold, calculating ambition. He did not see a warning for all of humanity. He saw leverage. His weathered face hardened as he turned from the main display, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "With this, we do not have to hide anymore, Aris. We can force the Earth Authority to listen. We can make the corporate rim pay for our protection. This is not just data. It is our key out of the shadows." Aris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. He saw the same fanatical glint in Rorik's eyes that he had seen in the Watcher's cold logic. a belief that ultimate knowledge granted the right to control. "You are talking about auctioning off a doomsday weapon," Aris said, his voice tight with disbelief. "That is not why we came to you." But Rorik was already moving, his hand drifting toward the sidearm on his hip. His own crew on the bridge shifted their stance, their loyalties clear. "I am talking about survival," he countered, his tone final, "and I am not asking." The air grew thick and electric. Before Rorik could draw his weapon, Lena's hand slammed down on the engineering console. A series of sharp, percussive clunks echoed through the ship as the Odyssey's internal security protocols engaged, magnetically locking every weapon mount and tactical system. The lights flickered, casting her face in stark relief. She stood between Rorik and the data core, her expression one of pure, unyielding resolve. "This is not a tool for power, Rorik," she declared, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "It is a disease, and we are destroying it." The standoff was absolute. They were no longer allies bound by a shared fear. They were two factions trapped on the same small ship, one believing the universe's most dangerous secret could be a shield, the other knowing it could only ever be a target. The fragile trust that had granted them refuge had shattered, leaving them stranded between the Watchers in the dark and a would-be king in their own bridge. The standoff on the bridge shattered with the shriek of a proximity alarm. Rorik's own ship, the Wind Singer, had turned its weapons on the Odyssey. Emerald energy lanced through the void, not to destroy but to cripple, striking their already weakened engines. Rorik's face twisted from ambition into cold fury. He had been outmaneuvered in his own gambit, and his crew was now enforcing his claim with brute force. The ship shuddered violently, consoles sparking as primary power fluctuated. "We are being tractored," Lena shouted, her hands flying across the engineering panel. "They are going to board us." In that chaos of flashing lights and shouting voices, Aris' mind latched onto a single, desperate variable. Jack's emergency jump protocol was still loaded, a catastrophic exit he had never dared to use. It was a choice between certain capture and probable oblivion. He input the command, his voice a raw command over the din. "Brace for a really bad decision." The universe outside the viewport did not stretch. It fractured. The familiar starfield twisted into a vortex of screaming light and impossible colors, the gravitational forces wrenching the Odyssey through a tear in reality itself. The sound was a physical assault, a roar of tortured metal and shearing spacetime. For a terrifying moment, they were nowhere and everywhere at once, their atoms threatening to fly apart. Then reality slammed back into place, hurling them into the heart of a binary star system. Two massive suns, one a furious blue giant and the other a dying red behemoth, locked in a violent gravitational dance, filled their view. The gravitational shear was immense, an invisible tide that grabbed the pursuing Wind Singer and flung it off course, its hull groaning in protest as it was pulled toward the system's fiery edge. But their escape came at a cost. A deafening crack echoed through the Odyssey's spine, followed by the sickening hiss of escaping atmosphere. A main support beam in the life support bay had sheared clean through. The central console flashed a catastrophic failure warning. Primary life support was offline. The backup systems engaged with a weak, struggling hum, and a stark red timer appeared on every screen. They had escaped one cage only to find themselves in another, this one counting down the final minutes of their breathable air. The red timer on the main console was a relentless, silent heartbeat, counting down the last of their air. Each flicker of the digit marked another breath they would not get back. The Odyssey's structural groans had subsided into a death rattle, the ship bleeding atmosphere into the violent binary system around them. Jack's emergency jump had saved them from Rorik, but it had also fractured the ship's spine. Aris ran the calculations, his fingers cold and clumsy on the console. The result was a grim, singular truth. They had enough power for one final, short-range jump before life support failed completely. Two sets of coordinates glowed on the nav screen. The first was a beacon of safety, a bustling trade outpost in a well-patrolled sector just within their remaining range. It promised repairs, air, and a chance to disappear into the anonymous currents of human space. The second set was the source of the new, powerful signal, a location deep within an unstable nebula the Watchers were certain to be monitoring. It was a suicide run. Lena did not look at the safe option. Her gaze was fixed on the signal, a complex mathematical song of distress that was now the loudest they had ever recorded. Her voice was quiet, stripped of all fear and doubt, leaving only a raw, unwavering conviction. "We started this to answer a call," she said, her eyes meeting Aris. "We have to finish it." The choice was no choice at all. Fleeing to safety meant condemning whatever was screaming from that nebula to the same fate as the Lumen and the machine consciousness. It meant proving the Watchers right, that self-preservation was the only universal law. It meant that Jax and Kale had died for nothing more than a secret to be buried. Aris' hand hovered over the navigation console, the weight of 2 lives and countless others balanced in that single moment. Then his fingers moved, inputting the sequence for the second set of coordinates. The safe harbor on the screen vanished, replaced by the swirling, chaotic map of the nebula. He did not give the order. He simply looked at Lena and gave a single, slow nod. It was an agreement, a pact sealed in the thinning air. They were not going to save themselves, they were going to bear witness. As the jump drive whined to life, charging for its final, fatal leap, the only sound left was the quiet, determined rhythm of their own breathing, each one a conscious gift to the silence they were about to break. The jump drive screamed its final, agonizing note, and reality snapped back into a form more terrible than the void. They hung motionless in the center of an artificial star system, a constellation of Watcher ships anchored around a central, lightless orb. It was not a true star, but a sphere of perfect, silent blackness that seemed to drink the very light from space around it. Before a single alarm could sound, an invisible force seized the Odyssey. The hum of the engines died instantly, the console lights winking out into a profound and absolute darkness. They were not just caught. They were swallowed, their ship rendered a dead, metallic fish in the belly of a leviathan. The only light now came from the viewport, where the silhouettes of the predatory vessels blotted out the strange, dark sun, their forms looming like silent judges in a court from which there was no appeal. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating blanket that stole sound and sight. Aris floated in a void of sensory deprivation, his own heartbeat the only anchor to reality. Then a single point of light appeared, swelling until it resolved into the sterile, gray interior of a featureless chamber. He was strapped to a cold metal chair, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. Across from him stood a figure, humanoid but unnervingly still. This was Valerius, his face a mask of serene, ageless calm, his eyes holding the cold light of distant stars. He did not speak aloud. His words bloomed directly in Aris' mind, a gentle, invasive pressure. "You have seen the truth, Dr. Thorne. The Scourge is not a monster to be slain. It is a law of physics, a necessary process for the health of the cosmos. To fight it is to fight gravity itself." In a seamless mental projection, Valerius showed him visions of civilizations that had learned of the Scourge, and in their hubris tried to weaponize it. He showed worlds consumed not by the Scourge, but by their own paranoid wars, their societies tearing themselves apart long before the reset ever reached them. Ignorance is the only vaccine for such madness. We offer you a purpose, a place within a grand design that has maintained stability for eons. Your unique understanding could serve a higher calling. Join us. Help us preserve the silence that allows life to flourish in its allotted time. The offer was seductive, wrapped in the cold logic of a trillion saved lives weighed against a few sacrificed worlds. It reframed his entire harrowing journey as a childish rebellion against an inevitable parental truth. In a separate, identical chamber, Lena faced the same serene interrogator. Valerius probed her mind not with threats, but with devastating simulations. He showed her a future where their data was released, a galaxy plunged into a chaotic, paranoid arms race where every emerging civilization was preemptively bombed for fear it might attract the Scourge. He showed her Earth itself, its governments fracturing into warlord states, all because of the truth she carried. Your defiance is not heroism, it is a tantrum. You wish to scream a secret into a crowded room, knowing it will cause a stampede. We offer you a chance to prevent that tragedy. Become a guardian of life, not a prophet of its doom. The alternative is not death. It is a return to innocence. A gentle procedure will remove the burden of this knowledge, and you will be returned to the fringes of human space, your minds clean slates, free to live out your lives in peaceful ignorance. Your ship and its dangerous cargo will be recycled into the void. The choice was a perfect, terrifying trap. They could become part of the very machine that had killed their friends and erased entire cultures, justified as a cosmic necessity. Or they could choose to forget, to let every sacrifice be rendered meaningless, their hard-won knowledge wiped away as if it had never existed. It was a choice between two kinds of oblivion, and the silence in their minds stretched on, waiting for an answer. Valerius' projection of a sterilized, peaceful galaxy hung in the air, a perfect cage of logic. Lena, however, was not listening to the words. She was listening to the silence between them. As he spoke, a low, resonant hum pulsed through the chamber, a byproduct of the station's immense power systems. It was a sound so constant it had become part of the background, like the beating of a heart. But Lena saw Valerius' left eye twitch, a flicker of tension so brief it was almost imperceptible. It happened again a moment later, synchronized with a subtle shift in the hum's frequency. Her own mind, trained to find patterns in chaos, latched onto the anomaly. It was not a conscious reaction to their conversation. It was a physical response to an auditory trigger. The Watchers, in all their advanced silent grace, were sensitive to sound. Their entire existence was built on silence, on stealth, on the suppression of noisy, chaotic broadcasts. What if their own technology, and the biology they had perfected to interface with it, shared that same vulnerability? While Aris wrestled with the philosophical trap, Lena began mapping the sonic landscape of their prison. She focused on the hum, identifying its core frequency, and then deliberately recalled a memory from the Odyssey's data banks. The exact resonant tone Kale had theorized could disrupt the Scourge's cohesion by vibrating its nanites apart. It was a frequency of pure disruption. She held that tone in her mind, a silent, internal scream, and watched Valerius. This time, the reaction was unmistakable. A minuscule tightening around his mouth, a slight, almost defensive lean away from her. He did not know she had found it, this tiny fracture in his absolute control. Their captors, the architects of silence, had a profound weakness. They could not tolerate a certain kind of noise. Lena now held the key, not to a lock, but to a shattering of the very peace they sought to impose. The hum was their key, a vibration that resonated deep within the station's bones. Aris focused his mind, recalling a childhood memory of striking a crystal glass and listening to its pure, singing tone. He held that frequency in his thoughts, a simple, clean note, and pushed it toward Lena through the faint psychic link their captors had opened. Across the station, she received the silent message, a blueprint for disruption. Using a hidden communicator she had assembled from scavenged components in her suit lining, she began broadcasting a low-level version of that same resonant frequency directly into the station's internal communication grid. At first, nothing happened, then a flicker. The sterile gray light in Aris' chamber stuttered. Valerius, who had been a statue of calm, flinched as if struck by a physical blow. The gentle hum of the station twisted into a distorted whine, a sound like tearing metal. The psychic pressure in Aris' mind vanished, replaced by a blessed, roaring silence. The restraints on his chair snapped open with a sharp click. He was free. The same scene played out in Lena's cell. The door to her chamber hissed open, revealing a corridor bathed in the pulsating red of emergency lights. The station's perfect harmony was shattered, replaced by a chaotic, screaming feedback loop that they had initiated. They fought their way toward the docking bay not with weapons but with sound. Lena used her communicator to pulse targeted bursts of the disruptive frequency at the Watcher guards they encountered. The effect was immediate and debilitating. The advanced beings, so dependent on silent order, recoiled from the sonic assault, their coordination breaking down into disoriented, individual struggles. It was not a battle of force, but of fundamental incompatibility. They reached the Odyssey to find it being prepared for dismantling, its systems powered down and cold. Working in frantic tandem, Aris and Lena bypassed the external locks, their hands moving by memory through the dark, familiar corridors of their own ship. As the engines flared to life, tearing the vessel from its magnetic clamps, they took one thing with them. Buried in the chaotic data stream of their escape, Lena had uploaded a fragment of the station's own archives, a single, damning record of a world the Watchers had silenced. They were not just escaping a prison, they were stealing a testimony. Fleeing was never the true objective. Their escape path was clear, an open corridor back to the relative safety of the void. But Aris and Lena exchanged a single, silent look that communicated an entire new plan. To run now would only reset the cycle, leaving the Watchers free to silence the next desperate call, the next world that dared to cry out. Their own ship was a lost cause, its systems failing and its hull compromised, but it could serve one final, vital purpose. They would turn it into a weapon. Lena rerouted all remaining power to the Odyssey's resonance emitters, the very same system she had used to disrupt their captors. She programmed a continuous, escalating loop of the disruptive frequency, a sonic scream that would flood the station and keep its guardians disoriented. Meanwhile, Aris accessed the station's internal schematics from a command console they had overloaded. He identified the primary power conduits that fed the station's gravity anchors and long-range sensors. Their goal was not a fiery explosion, but a precise, surgical strike. Using scavenged energy cells from their own damaged systems, they fashioned a series of crude but powerful charges. Each one was calibrated to the specific resonant frequency that so agonized the Watchers. They were not planting bombs. They were planting seeds of silence, timed to detonate in a cascading chain reaction. The first charge would cripple the primary sensor array, blinding the station. The second would rupture the main power conduit, and the third, placed at a critical juncture in the gravity control system, would trigger a core implosion, collapsing the entire structure into its own heart. It was a desperate, one-way mission. As the final charge was set, the Odyssey's internal alarms blared a final, desperate warning. Life support was at 5%. They had minutes, not hours. But as they sprinted through the shuddering, red-lit corridors toward their dying ship, a profound sense of purpose eclipsed their fear. They were no longer just two people fighting for survival. They were a counterweight, a single, defiant act of noise in a universe conditioned to accept a terrible, silent peace. Their sabotage was a message to the future, a hope that the next time a mathematical song of distress echoed through the void, it would find a listening ear, not a waiting blade. The station tore itself apart in a silent, terrifying ballet of imploding metal and snapping energy conduits. A shockwave of distorted gravity hurled the Odyssey clear, sending them tumbling end over end into the blackness. For a few precious seconds, They were just another piece of debris, lost in the violent birth of a new nebula of wreckage. Then the first Watcher frigate emerged from the chaos, its weapons already glowing with a cold, vengeful light. Lena slammed her hand on the jump drive, initiating an uncharted sequence with no destination, only the desperate need to be anywhere but here. The universe twisted around them one last time, the stars stretching into meaningless lines before snapping back into a new, unfamiliar arrangement. The sudden stillness was absolute. They hung in a region of space so empty it felt like a physical void, the distant galaxies nothing more than faint smudges of light. Their ship was a wreck, its hull groaning with the memory of its final, desperate flight, but the relentless pursuit was gone. They were alone, adrift in the deepest quiet they had ever known, finally free. The silence after the explosion was a different kind of quiet, filled not with dread but with a fragile, hard-won peace. Their ship was a drifting wreck, but they were alive and they were finally alone. In the dim emergency lighting, Lena accessed the stolen archive from the machine world, its cold data unfolding across their sole-functioning screen. It was not merely a history of the Scourge. It was its complete genealogy, tracing the path of the cosmic sterilizer back through time and space to a single, impossible coordinate. The archive identified it as the Cradle, the original forge where the precursor race had built their terrible solution, and buried in the final lines of code was a theory, a whisper of a chance. The Cradle was not just a point of origin, it was a control node. It was the one place in the universe where the cycle could be broken forever. The simple act of answering a call for help had been their first step. Surviving the Watchers had been the second. Now, holding a map to the source of all the suffering they had witnessed, their mission transformed in an instant. They were no longer rescuers or fugitives. They were the spearhead of a crusade, two people in a broken ship aiming for the heart of a galaxy-spanning nightmare. The weight of the knowledge was immense, a burden that made their previous struggles feel like a prelude. They had the location of the master switch, and the terrifying responsibility to decide if they should throw it.